Hello and a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all joining from different corners of the globe in what we expect to be an extremely interesting discussion exploring Doughnut Economics today. I'm Benjamin Simmons, head of the GGKP Secretariat, and I would like to thank you for joining today's webinar entitled, Can a Doughnut Help Us Recover from COVID-19? Today's event has been organized jointly with the Korea Green Growth Trust Fund and the World Bank Group. This is our first of what we hope are many future events organized jointly with these partners. Before we get started, I did want to mention a few words on the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership for those of you who may not be as familiar with the initiative. We are a global network of 75 organizations and thousands of experts from the policy, business, and finance communities, all committed to working together to support a green economy transition. We do this through our three global knowledge platforms: the policy-focused Green Growth Knowledge Platform, the Green Finance Platform, and the Green Industry Platform. I'm also very happy to report that less than a week ago, we launched the Green Forum. This is our online community space that provides an opportunity for experts to engage directly with one another through public discussion boards and public and private group discussions focused on a sustainable economy transition. I would encourage you to visit and join the discussion on the Green Forum. You can do this at www.thegreenforum.org, and also join the 13,000 other experts currently receiving our newsletter by subscribing to ggkp.org/subscribe. So now, before introducing the moderators for today's event, I would just like to remind everyone that we always have, as you know, active discussions during these events. So I'd encourage you to join the discussion by using the chat function. And of course, after the webinar, we'd appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete our short survey. The responses always help us when thinking about future webinars and improving future webinars. Finally, please note that today's presentations, as well as a full recording of the webinar, will be available on our website. It is now my great pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's event, Richard Damania. He is the Chief Economist for the Sustainable Development Practice Group at the World Bank. Prior to taking on his current role as Chief Economist for Sustainable Development, Richard also worked in senior roles in the World Bank regional groups, including the Africa, South Asia, and Latin American and Caribbean groups. Richard has published over 100 papers in scientific journals and is a recognized global expert on issues relating to the environment, water, and the economy. And most importantly, at least from my perspective, is Richard is also the World Bank Senior Representative on the GGKP Steering Committee. So Richard, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to today's webinar and pleased to turn over the virtual podium to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a true honor to be here and to be the moderator of this really, really important event. Nothing could be more important after the pandemic, after 2020, which was a year like no other. Can a doughnut help us recover? That is the question of the day that we are waiting to hear from our experts. So today, just to give you a very quick rundown of the way we're going to run this webinar, we'll have some opening remarks by Juergen Voegele, who's the Vice President of the Sustainable Development Practice Group. After that, of course, the star of the show is going to be Kate Raworth, who's going to, of course, tell us how the doughnut can help us in this recovery. And then we will have a panel discussion, and I will introduce our panelists, Kumi Kitamori from the OECD and Zeenat from Development Alternatives. So without further ado, it gives me very great pleasure to welcome the Vice President of the Sustainable Development Practice Group, Juergen Voegele. Just a few words about Juergen. Not only is he the Vice President in the World Bank of the Sustainable Development Practice Group, but under his jurisdictions lies the Agriculture and Food Global Practice, the Climate Change Practice, the Environment Practice, Social Development, Urban, and Water. Might we say the most important real sectors of the economy. If we get that right, we've probably solved most of the problems that we actually have. Prior to becoming Vice President, Juergen was the Global Director of the World Bank's Climate Change Group. Before that, he was a Director of the Agriculture and Food Group. He's the Chair of the CGIAR System Council Board. He served as Co-Chair of the Global Future Council of the World Economic Forum. and he's a member of the EAT Foundation Advisory Board. No one could be more qualified and more experienced than Juergen to give us some introductory remarks. Juergen, with very great pleasure, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. Good morning, and also thanks, Ben, for having us on this call. Welcome to everybody from around the globe to join us in this conversation. Like Richard says, now is the time to get this right. And we haven't gotten it right in the past. That's why we are in the mess we are in. I think that's clear to everybody now, a year into this pandemic. So we really need to think a lot harder going forward, how we can prevent and avoid the next COVID, how we're going to deal with climate change, how we're going to deal with the social implications that these perennial and permanent and overlapping crises have on our individuals and on our societies. The world is on fire at the moment in many different ways. And I believe, and many of my colleagues believe, there is a reason for that. And one of the reasons for that is that we have not fully understood, or even if we have understood, not fully taken into account and taken seriously what it takes to have really sustainable growth rather than just short-term growth at the expense of the environment or at the expense of the social capital with which we operate. So let me be very brief, because I hear Kate mentioned she will take about 30 minutes to walk us through her approach and her thinking about economics in the future. And I cannot tell you how delighted and excited I am to have Kate on this call and to have the opportunity to interact, because we cannot, there is one thing we understand, I think everybody after 1 year into this mess, is that we cannot go back the same way where we came from before the crisis. We have to, for once now, in the beginning of the 21st century, take it much more seriously that whatever we do has implications, that we are reaching tipping points on a planetary scale right now. If we don't understand those, if we don't deal with those going into the next decades, we will get to points of no return for hundreds of millions and possibly more people that are already hurting and that are already suffering. So while on aggregate, while overall the world is moving forward and GDP grows and the stock markets rise and things go well on the surface, everywhere there are creaks and cracks. And we need to just begin to understand that this is no longer an add-on or something that we do after we run the models. We have to take all these considerations right into the heart of what we do, into our policy decision making and the way we think about our future economy and future society. And let me assure those on the call at the World Bank, we have very, very intense conversations right now. What it means to rebuild better, to rebuild greener, to rebuild more sustainable, to rebuild more inclusive, very importantly, and to do all that in an efficient way, because right now every dollar counts. There is not enough money available right now to deal with a crisis in most of our client countries in the developing world. And it's very important that we get this right. And I hope that in this conversation we can get a little bit beyond the trade-off conversation, because of course there are always trade-off when you have limited resources. But the focus must be on those win-win-wins. What is it that we can do and countries can do with the limited resources they have? They set them on that sets them on a path of development that does not lead to the hangovers that we are dealing with right now. And there is lots out there. In the energy sector, the transition is ongoing. In the transport/urban environment, where we can move towards much more zero emissions. And in the food system, which is typically underrated and not discussed to the extent it doesn't get the attention that it really deserves. Because the food system is 25 to 30% of all global emissions, and between food production and land use change, for instance, in Latin America, we're looking at 60% of their entire greenhouse gas emissions. And unlike energy, where we have solar panels and windmills, and unlike transport, where the electric car is racing ahead and we have many other solutions coming our way, in the food systems transformation, we are still at the beginning. There is really not a strong enough, clear enough understanding that this needs to be done very urgently, and that it has the potential to actually become a net positive part of the economy rather than a subtracting part of the economy, both economically, financially, as it is right now, and environmentally. So with that, and I know Kate has done a lot of thinking, I've watched with interest some of your presentations on the web. And, you know, I'm just fascinated by, you know, someone saying, look, we don't have to turn everything upside down, but we have to really rethink fundamentally some of the ways we go about economics. So with that, happy to join here, and I look forward to the presentation. Back to you, Richard.
Thank you so much, Juergen. Let me now introduce the star of our show while we're all here. It's Kate Raworth, who you all would have heard of and know about her work. She's the Senior Research Associate at the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford University. In addition, she's Professor of Practice at Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. She calls herself, appropriately perhaps, a renegade economist who's focused on changing our economic and other mindsets and how we actually think about these deep problems that we endure. She has a very long CV that I won't go into. Suffice it to say that not only is she the creator of Doughnut Economics, but she does very many good things and is a very busy person indeed. So without eating into her time, without further ado, Kate, the floor is entirely yours, and please take it over.
Thank you so much, Richard and Juergen. Thank you to everybody for this opportunity. I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have. So I'm going to share my screen because we are indeed going to talk about donuts. So, as Juergen said, this is a time of the world being on fire, and we need to look fundamentally at some of the systems and the economic concepts that we've inherited. And that's where I want to start. I want to start with the 20th century economics that many of us on this webinar will have been taught. I'm 50 years old, so I was taught in the early 1990s, and these were the concepts that deeply underpin the economic mindsets that we've inherited. So the starting point, and I still find it's the starting point for so many students today, is of course supply and demand. Welcome to economics, here is the market. We put supply and demand in the market at the center of our vision, and that prioritizes price as the metric of concern. And things that fall outside of the market contract are named externalities. And there already we have an alarm bell that we are talking about now, the death of the living world. We described as an environmental externality. To me, that is enough of an alarm bell to tell us that 20th century framing of economics does not serve our times. The portrait of humanity at the center of the economics we've inherited, we know, of course, is rational economic man. He's described in the textbook, he still lives on in the models, as an individual, a man who stands alone with money in his hand, ego in his heart, a calculator in his head, and nature at his feet. He hates work, he loves luxury, but he knows the price of everything. And this narrow definition not only is an absurd description of us, but we know from research by people like Robert Frank that it actually changes us. So students over time more say they value self-interest and competition than collaboration and altruism. Who we tell ourselves we are shapes who we become. We need to put a real description of humanity that actually nurtures the best of human nature at the heart of economic thinking. And then thirdly, the goal. What is the goal of 20th century economics? It's so deep and so profound, it's never actually drawn in the textbooks, but it underpins every conversation. And the goal is, of course, endless economic growth, showing up as an ever-rising GDP. And that is ever rising, no matter how rich a country already is. So I'm sitting here in the UK, one of the richest countries in the world. It's richer than any nation before has actually been through history. And yet we believe here that the solution to the problems we face today lies in yet more growth. And to me, that tells us there's something profoundly wrong with what we think the shape of progress is. And then the dynamics of our economies in the 20th century, thanks to the brilliant work of Simon Kuznets, which I think was deeply misinterpreted. The Kuznets curve told us that growth will even things up again. We have to go through pain of inequality, but we'll come out more equal the other side. It's turned out not to be true. Thomas Piketty and others have shown that the Kuznets curve does not hold, but it has a very long tail of influence. And in the environmental space too, the environmental Kuznets curve told us since the early 1990s that growth will somehow clean up after itself. It may do so for some local pollutants, but what we know about global pollutants like carbon dioxide and like a nation's material footprint, this curve does not bend down without extreme intervention. We haven't even seen the extremes of intervention that we would require to make this curve. So we need to transform our ideas of what are the dynamics of our economies. Because the 21st century has actually begun with multiple crises. We're here talking in the context of COVID, but let's reflect that this century has begun first With the financial crisis that hit worldwide and again has a long tail of influence that's hit many lives through austerity in North and South worldwide, we live in an era of climate and ecological breakdown, and we are all worldwide in different ways affected by the current COVID lockdown. And these crises tell us we are deeply interconnected with each other and with the rest of the living world, that they hit with sharp inequalities of gender and of race, of wealth and power, of global north and global south. But these crises, they all arise out of the systems that we've created, and these are systems based upon endless expansion. So if we create a financial system that presumes to endlessly expand, it's probably going to kick off a subprime mortgage market. If we have an industrial system that endlessly expands its use of fossil fuels and Earth's resources, we will induce climate and ecological breakdown. And if we have a human settlement pattern that is endlessly expanding into areas of wildlife, combined with endlessly increased travel between nations and flights, we create the conditions for zoonotic disease transfer and global pandemic creation. So we need to deeply transform the systems that we've created, because these crises are messages back from our own systems that we are undermining the very sources of our well-being. And that's where the idea of the donut comes in. So you can think of it as a compass for 21st century prosperity, where we want to leave nobody falling short on Earth's resources, on their share of using Earth's resources to meet their essential needs, such as food, water, energy, healthcare, and housing. These 12, I crowdsourced from the world's governments. They are recognizably from the Sustainable Development Goals, which means the governments of the world have already agreed that all people have a claim to these essentials. But at the same time, leave no one in the hole, but don't overshoot that outer ceiling, because there we put so much pressure on our living planet that we break down her life supporting systems. And these 9 are the 9 planetary boundaries recognized little more than a decade ago as the critical life supporting systems that make life work on this planet. So the goal of the donut is to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. Some people call that radical. Others would say it's utter common sense. It's human rights with ecological integrity. There's nothing radical about that. It's just time to put it at the center of our vision. And the shape of progress has already changed. It's not ever rising growth here. It's balance, which we know at the level of our bodies as health. And so we need to go from bodily health to planetary health. How can humanity live in a balance with the rest of the living world? Because right now we are way out of that balance. All the red shows us the extent to which worldwide people are falling short on meeting the essentials of life. For example, on food, Juergen was talking about the food system. That red wedge goes 11% of the way to the middle of the circle, because 11% of people worldwide don't have enough food to eat every day. But you can see there's human shortfall on every one of those dimensions. And yet at the same time as that ongoing human deprivation, we have already exceeded multiple planetary boundaries. And so we are outside of this space on both sides at the same time. And last century's economic theories and economic policies and business models were not designed to solve for this. So why on earth would we expect them to do it? We need to come up with economic theories and policies and business models that actually are designed with our 21st century knowledge of the crises we are in and our intention to turn this story around. Can we be the generation that actually starts to turn this around? Can we harness each of these crises, including the latest COVID crisis, to open up that crack in history where you begin to turn the story around and change the direction of impact? I'm showing this story here at the global level. But of course, most policymaking doesn't happen at the global level. A lot of it happens at the national level. So my colleague Andrew Fanning at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, along with other researchers at Leeds University, downscaled the donut for over 150 countries. You can see the website there, the Good Life Leeds website. But here are just 3. So we've got on the one hand Malawi, where generating around $1,000 per person per year. People living in massive human deprivation, all that red shortfall in the center of the circle, but not overshooting any of those planetary boundaries. So well within its share of impacts on Earth's life supporting systems. China in the middle on around $17,000 per person per year, similar to many countries, both significantly falling short and already in significant overshoot. And then I've chosen Norway, one of the highest income countries in the world. I've chosen Norway because it's one of the very few that actually has a fully blue circle. That does not mean there are no social problems in Norway. This is a very low, internationally comparable global bar. So actually all high income nations should absolutely be succeeding on filling that circle in blue, but few of them do. Norway is one of the countries that again and again comes at the top of the Human Development Index, and that blue circle tells us why. But like all high income countries, it is massively in overshoot on its pressure on the planet, massively overshooting its share of carbon emissions, of footprint use, of material footprint, of land use, of water, of fertilizer use, and so has to come back within those. So there's the story of 3 countries. Now let me put them on this chart of all countries in the world and pick out those 3 that I was talking about. You can see them scattered across this plot. The sweet spot is the top left-hand corner, where we meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. And first we can see that there's not one country that can say we're there. And to me, this immediately tells us there is no country in the world that should describe itself as a developed nation. So I invite everybody on this call to catch yourself next time you say a developed country, because I don't think there are any. None of these countries are developed. When we put our concept of what prosperity is in the 21st century, nobody's there. Everybody is now on a developing pathway towards that future. And so we've got the traditionally lower income nations that need to meet people's needs for the first time. Can they do that without overshooting planetary boundaries in the way every nation before them has done? That is an unprecedented journey. We've got emerging economies and middle income nations that have the double whammy challenge of meeting people's needs for the first time while already coming back within those planetary boundaries. How can they do that? Because that's not been done before either. And then the high income nations that should already be meeting all people's needs because they certainly have the income and resources to do so, but they are massively overshooting planetary boundaries. How do they come back within? That too is an unprecedented developmental journey that's never been done before. And so I believe this chart shows us that all countries need a level of humility and unprecedented ambition for this challenge ahead. But it's necessary to say that though these countries look like separated dots on a scatter plot, they are, of course, deeply interconnected. Their stories and histories and futures, through histories of colonialism, especially from the global north to the global south, through ongoing military power, through the policies of structural adjustment imposed in the 1980s, through ongoing finance and trade rules which are skewed against the global south, through ongoing resource extraction and land grabs, and then the present and future impacts of climate change. These patterns strongly fall from created in the global north, impacting in the global south. And so we have to recognize that we need a transformation within all nations to move towards the donut, but also a transformation of the relations between all nations. This invites us to look at the question at the national level, but I'm going to take it down again another level, to the level of cities. And this is because this is where we were first invited to work through the C40 network of cities with cities in the global north who have the responsibility to move first and fastest into the donut. And so we asked ourselves, how would we downscale the framework of the donut to the scale of the city? And I want to invite everybody on this call to think of a city that you might either be in or near to, one that you know very well, you work in, you're the mayor of, or you're an employee in, or a resident. Think of a city that you know and love and ask yourself these questions. How can our city become a home to thriving people in a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? And that breaks out into 4 questions, what we call the 4 lenses of creating a city portrait through the lenses of the donut. The first question is, what would it mean for the people of our city to thrive? Who lives in our city in that full diversity of people here and the full diversity of their lived experience? What are the values, the culture, the history and aspirations of this place that would make us say, this is a good life that all should have a claim to? And that answer may differ from Stockholm to Dar es Salaam to Mumbai. Secondly, what would it mean for our city to thrive within its natural habitat? Where is your city on the surface of planet Earth? In which ecological biome? Is it by the sea or up a mountain, in a floodplain or on a plateau? And what is nature's way of thriving and surviving there? And what would it mean for your city to actually belong and mimic nature's genius? So for your city to cool the air as nature does in the nearby forest, for the city to store groundwater or to house biodiversity, or to build soil and clean the air just as nature has learned to do in that place. So these 2 are what we call the local aspirations, thriving people in a thriving place. And many cities focus only on these. But we, of course, have to recognize that every city on the planet's surface is embedded in social and ecological relations worldwide. And so we also have to ask questions of global responsibility. What would it mean for our city to respect the health of the whole planet? Think of all the food, the clothing, the electronics goods, the construction materials, the consumer goods that are imported into cities, and all the waste stream that goes out, and the impacts that that's having worldwide in terms of carbon emissions, water use, material footprint, fertilizer use in other parts of the world. How can a city bring its impact back within those boundaries of the donut? That is a transformation that's never been done till now. But also think again of those supply chains I just mentioned in food and clothing, electronics and construction materials. Whose labor is picking and packing that food? Who's stitching and sewing the clothes? Who's digging and transporting the materials? Who's assembling the phones and the laptops that we use? And what are those labor relations like? And the impacts not only on the workers, but on the communities involved. That's just one of many ways in which cities are connected to and have impacts on people's lives worldwide. So these are the four lenses of the city portrait, putting local aspiration in the context of global responsibility. And we've actually created the first of these city portraits with Amsterdam, Portland, and Philadelphia. As I mentioned, cities of the global north, who we believe have the responsibility to move first and fastest into bringing their city life into that space of the donut. So what comes out if we actually start having the discussion? How would this change our economic stance? I think the first starting point has to be that we need a new first picture when we encounter economic thinking. It's not supply and demand. I offer this picture, I call it the embedded economy diagram. It reminds us that the economy is embedded within society. It is a social construct. And society, human society, is embedded within the rest of the living world. We're drawing in materials and matter, putting out waste and pollution, and bathed in a river of solar energy. But go within the economy, look, it's not just the market. Sure, we show up as consumer or producer, shopping or working. And in that producer relationship, are you capital reaping the rents of capital, or are you labor earning just a wage? Yes, there is that market relationship, but so too is the relationship of the state. We may be a public servant, and there's unprecedented recognition for the importance of key workers and public servants now. We may be resident, voter, or protester, all crucial roles that we can play in relation to our lives of cities. But also the household, that space of unpaid caring labor where we are partner, parent, relative, and child, the cooking, washing, cleaning, sweeping, raising the children, and ensuring people are ready to go to work, whether it's the market or the state. But also don't forget the commons, where we come together as communities, not through the market, not through the state, but as a community with an intention of co-creating value, sometimes without money changing hands. So there we may be volunteer, a sharer, a co-creator, or a steward. So these are all essential roles that each one of us plays in the lives of our cities and indeed our national economies. And we often don't name them, but I think it's crucial to recognize the importance of all four of these forms of economic provisioning that make the economy work well when it works. What COVID has done is shown us and highlighted that when the market space is literally shut down due to the need for physical distancing, that is when the state has to step in. And that's when the recognition for the crucial role of state services is revealed, but also the work of the household increases, caring for the ill, homeschooling children, the pressure. Some people have found joy in the household, some people have found unprecedented tension and an increase in domestic violence, but also the rise of the commons and people realizing we need our communities, whether it's through a street WhatsApp group or organizing to provide a food kitchen, a food bank, supporting our neighbors. And the one thing that people worldwide say is they don't want to lose after the pandemic is gone is that communal sense of the we of society. How do we ensure that we recover and rebuild our economies and transform them, holding this social space that recognizes the multiplicity of our economic roles? So along with this, how do we bring our cities into the donut? The red in this image shows us that we have deeply degenerative economies that are running down the sources of the living world, overshooting planetary boundaries, but also deeply divisive economies that are leaving many people without the ability to meet the most basic needs. And we know from the 20th century theory that growth is not going to even things up again. It doesn't just happen. Growth is not going to clean up after itself. We need new principles here. And so I offer the ideas of creating economies that by design are regenerative and distributive. And I'll illustrate what I mean by both of those. So this is the shape of degenerative economies. We take Earth's materials, make them into stuff we want, use it for a while and throw it away. And this is what it looks like when we take again and again and again from Earth's sources. And this is what it looks like when we throw our waste again and again and again into Earth's sinks. plastics into lakes and rivers, electronic waste into the neighborhoods of the world's poorest people. I sincerely believe that our grandchildren will pull pictures like these from the archive and turn to each of us and say, did you know about this? Did you actually know this was happening? Because they will see it for what it is, which is an extraordinary and appalling exploitation of the living world and our fellow human beings. And so we need to transform that dynamic from running down the living world to regenerating the cycles of life, working with and within Earth's life supporting systems, creating economies that run on renewable energy, where waste from one process becomes food for the next, that will be modular by design, moving from ownership to service use. So some examples. I'm going to start with in a high income nation where we should start and we should see first and fast action. In the city of Amsterdam, they've committed to having 100% circular economy by 2050, 50% circular material use by 2030, and introducing it now into the construction code. So there's districts in Amsterdam where they are building only circular materials. These are materials that have been used and reused and can be reused again. These buildings aren't glued and cemented together. They're clipped and bolted and screwed together so they can be unclipped and unbolted and unscrewed again. But in Nairobi, the toilets that have been installed there, it's one of the cities where there were no toilets in these districts, and now there are, thanks to companies like Sanergy, who've installed toilets on a community basis throughout the neighborhoods. The waste, so first of all, people have an opportunity to have dignity and health and hygiene, which we know has massive impacts on the community's well-being. But also that waste is collected every day, and then it's turned back into fertilizer for farmers' fields. So at the technical level, they're closing the nutrient loop, but at the social level, they are creating health and good jobs and vibrant farming. In Togo, in the city of Lomé, amazing WoLab have gone to those electronic waste dumps where the global north has dumped its waste products and extracted incredibly valuable materials and started redesigning and rebuilding 3D printers from those materials. And the first thing you do with a 3D printer is print another 3D printer. And so they have actually begun what's called cosmo-local production of a circular 3D economy, bottom up, using the waste of the global north. And then I want to bring in an example of literally regenerating the landscape and the city recognizing its place. So the city of Medellin in Colombia, recognizing that the river that it used to use as a sort of handy industrial sewer actually is a heart of life through the city. So opening up the river and recognizing it's a force of life, creating parks around that river and bringing humanity and nature back to the very design of the city. So that's from degenerative to regenerative, but we also need to move from cities whose infrastructure and technologies and institutions are divisive in a way that they drive opportunity and value into the hands of a few. We need to create cities and nations indeed that are distributive, in which opportunity and value are shared far more equitably with all who co-create it, and we pre-distribute that opportunity. So what does distributive look like when we see it in practice? The city of Curitiba in Brazil has been a forerunner in the space of affordable, high-speed mass transit with their bus system, their dedicated bus lanes. Since the 1970s, hundreds of cities around the world have copied their successful example, showing that you can make transport that's fast, affordable for people who spend hours commuting from the suburbs into the city centre on low wages to do low-paid jobs, to make that a priority of the city. The brilliant architect Alejandro Aravena in Chile and in Argentina realized that many people would never be able to afford to buy a house. But he realized that they could maybe afford to buy half a house. So he started literally designing and building half houses that you can see here, that have all the electricity, the heating, the plumbing that you need. You buy that half house, and then over the years, as you save up money, you can then fill the rest in. And by sheerly changing the design of what it means to have a house, he has made the ownership of housing affordable to a whole swathe of people who otherwise would have been stuck the rest of their lives in a rental market, losing the value to a landlord. Instead, they can own that asset and reinvest in their own futures. In the city of Bogota, again in Colombia, taking public spaces that are given over to cars and saying, why should the cars get the priority here? What if we were actually to turn this into a public space? Community luxury, places where people in a city can meet. They can meet people like themselves, and they can meet people unlike themselves. And this is what it takes to build community, to create a sense of being part of a commons. And then lastly, microgrids throughout Bangladesh. This may look like an assortment of roofs, but if you look very carefully, you will see they are covered in miniature solar panels, which are attached within each household to a microgrid. So creating a microgrid where the solar panel and the capacity to buy and sell energy through the system is empowered at the level of the household. Some examples of distributive design. And what I want to say is that I think this century, we need all the opportunity and the positivity we can get, because there's a lot coming at us. And I think one big opportunity is to recognize that the technologies are transforming in our favor. So all production systems require a technology of energy source, a means of production, a form of communication, the store of knowledge. And in the 20th century, these were centralizing by design. Energy through an oil rig or a pipeline, production in a mass Fordist factory, communications, literally every phone call went through a centralized switchboard, and knowledge since the 1500s in patents and copyrights. For the first time in human history, the technologies that we have are inviting us to make these distributive by design. So energy in solar panels, as I've just shown, in every village around the world. Production coming desktop, 3D printing, micro workshops and factories are possible. Communications is in the hand of every participant of this webinar, including this woman in Tanzania. And knowledge, not only in patents and copyrights, but also in Creative Commons licensing. I think we have barely begun to put together these 4 technologies. What if we were actually to harness them, the synergy between them, and to put them to the service of creating regenerative distributive economies worldwide, in rural areas, in countries where people are massively underserved by these kinds of technologies now? I think there is an unprecedented chance to make that happen. So I want to pull back and ask, why do some cities still focus on serving growth as if that was enough of an articulation of a goal, where others are clearly already serving thriving? And this I'm drawing now from work we've done in the global north, and I invite everybody to reflect on what this would look like in cities that you know of the global south. So cities that are still serving growth, when I talk to the mayors and the councillors, they're still asking the overriding question of how can we make our city grow? And especially in the global north, this was a very dominant 20th century question. But if you talk to those in cities that are transforming, they ask, how can we make our city thrive? Now, our city may be growing. The population may be increasing because people are migrating and we have urbanization happening, but we're not pursuing growth as a goal. Growth is a trend. We're pursuing thriving. What divides these cities? I think it's these 5 design traits and the way that the city institutions are designed to make them work. And I'm going to just give examples from each one, again, from the global north. So what is the purpose of the city? When I speak to policymakers in Amsterdam, who were the first city to publish and adopt the Doughnut framework, they already had a circular strategy and a renewable energy strategy and a sustainability strategy and intention for social inclusion. And they said, we actually want to bring this together. And that's why we've adopted the Doughnut and colored it orange in Dutch colors, because this actually provides a frame and a vision for our purpose. And if you hear the mayor and city councillors speaking, the vision they've set for themselves is for Amsterdam to be a thriving, inclusive, regenerative city for all residents while respecting planetary boundaries. Now, that is a very different purpose from what you would have heard in the 20th century. But it's not enough to have a fine purpose in a speech. It has to be backed up by city policies and practice. So city networks. How does the city network with its citizens and residents, with its suppliers, and the role of anchor institutions? So a city has a city hall, it has schools and hospitals and museums and institutions that are not going to leave, and they are all purchasing. How can those anchor institutions use their purchasing power to transform what is being purchased? Amsterdam is introducing circular procurement. So by 2030, they say we want to have 50% of the materials that are in our city procurement must be circular materials. And already by 2022, next year, that's going to be 10%. So they are beginning now and ramping up. In the city of Cleveland in Ohio, the city hospital was on the edge of a low-income neighborhood. And the city hospital realized that almost nobody who lives around here works here. So what if we create a scheme to actually enable people from this neighborhood to get good jobs in our hospital? Mothers returning from maternity leave, people who've had previous convictions, people who don't have the educational qualifications that are usually asked for, but actually can do this job if we create that scheme. And they've enabled many people from the city and the district to get good jobs because they intentionally focused on hiring them. And then the city of Melbourne, realizing it wanted to work with renewable energy, but if we bring together multiple of these city partners, go into a long-term 10-year contract with a fixed price, it enabled a wind farm to be built because of the supply. The supply could be created because the demand was there. So long-term partnership contracts can transform the supply of energy. Governance, so many things one could mention here, but what I'm seeing, especially in cities I'm seeing in the global north, the rise of citizens' assemblies, because citizens, unlike policymakers, don't have to try and get themselves re-elected after 4 years. And so they're not afraid to speak out for the policies that we already know we need, but that might not seem popular at the ballot box. And so they can nominate and promote values that then can become part of policy. Setting ambitious regulations, I've already mentioned in Amsterdam, they said by 2025, no more fossil fuel boats in the canals, electric boats only. By 2030, no more fossil fuel vehicles in the city, electric vehicles only. That gives a long, loud, legal message to anyone in transport that if you want to be part of this city in the future, you need to transform now. And then learning through experiment and through new metrics. Again, in Amsterdam, a district called Bijksloterham has been designated as a circular economy living lab. All the buildings there, as I showed, are circular. Let's learn in this place. And from this place, we can then turn that into wider policy. And of course, I think that is actually the role that cities are playing themselves. Let's learn in cities and turn it into national and then international policy. To ownership, crucial question, who owns the land and the housing? Who owns the utilities that serve this city? Who owns the data that we know is so valuable? And who owns the businesses? Whoever owns these entities reaps the rents that they afford. And so why not ensure that they are owned collectively by the community, by the city, so that the value is returned to the city? And lastly, finance. Is finance in service to the city, or actually is the city in service to finance? Where does the city revenue come from? And as many cities are recovering from COVID, where is that additional budget coming from and what can it be used for? How will city budgeting reflect the values that we want to embody and make happen in practice? And how can the city use its own funds, its pensions, for example, ensure that it divests from fossil fuels and invests in the future that we already want to bring about? So that's a very quick run through of these 5 design traits that I think can be applied to every city in the global north and global south to ensure that the city institutions are designed to bring about regenerative and distributive design and bring us into the donut. So I want to wrap up and say we've left behind those starting points of 20th century economics a long ago. We are now in the space of bringing ourselves into the donut, recognizing the economy is embedded in the living world. The we of society is the human person that we want to put at the heart of our vision in all of our complexity. We want to be regenerative and distributive by design and design our institutions to actually bring this about. The last thing I want to say is I invite everybody to imagine what this looks like in the city where they live. And I'm so looking forward to the discussion. What would it look like to transform this for cities of the global south? But lastly, I have to come back to this diagram because I have touched upon cities. So I have been looking at a specific set of relationships, but it's just so important to say we still need to recognize the power relationships between the global north and global south. These two need transforming, and these are transformed so often above the level of city policy making. So I welcome anybody who wants to bring these into the conversation. I'll stop there and very much look forward to turning this into a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was phenomenal. That was excellent. It was eloquent, it was provocative, it was far-reaching, and it's just what we needed to challenge our conventional thinking because we face problems of a kind that are unmatched now. We faced them a long time ago. We just didn't realize that we were actually there. So now, ladies and gentlemen, we're going into this next part of this webinar where we're going to have a panel discussion. So it's a very great pleasure. I'd like to introduce our 2 panelists who are immensely well qualified in different spheres to comment on what we just heard from Kate. So one of our panelists is Kumi Kitamori, who is the head of division of Green Growth and Global Relations in the OECD. Of course, she's very well qualified for this. She oversees the mainstreaming of the work on green growth right across the policy committees of the OECD. Before that, she worked in the OECD Environment Directorate. She led a flagship report on the environmental outlook to 2050 in the OECD. And indeed, she's also been the advisor to the OECD Secretary General. Before that, Kumi actually worked in the World Bank on urban and environmental infrastructure projects. And Kumi, as we've heard, your OECD countries might think they're developed, but they have a long way to go in terms of true development. Second panelist is Zeenat Niazi. Zeenat comes from the Development Alternatives, where she is the Vice President of the Development Alternatives. By training, Zeenat is an architect and a planner. She has over 2 decades of experience in design and strategic actions. She represents Development Alternatives on a body called the Independent Research Forum, which develops frameworks for the SDGs. She's the founder of an organization called Basin South Asia, which is a regional knowledge platform for housing, habitats, and cities. So very relevant to what we've heard. And indeed, she represents Development Alternatives on the Climate Action Network of South Asia. For those of you who are involved in the climate space, you will know that that is quite an influential organization that's done excellent things. I'm going to pose a question to each of our panelists, and then I'm going to ask Kate to comment on their answers as we go forward, and then really open it up for general discussion. Please keep your questions coming in the chat box. At the end of the panel discussion, we'll pick these questions and pose them to our panelists for an open discussion. We really have got some very, very far-reaching questions already emerging in the chat box. But let me start with you, Kumi. Your countries, OECD, think of themselves as developed, but we know that they have a long way to go. And we know that the impacts of the pandemic have stretched deep and wide across the OECD in ways that have exposed some of their foundational weaknesses. What to you are the key lessons that you draw from what we've heard today in Doughnut Economics that you think are relevant, A, in the recovery phase, but B, going forward in terms of the trajectory that we actually have for developing countries? So over to you, Kumi. If you could try to answer in about 3 to 5 minutes, that would be wonderful.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Richard, and thank you, Kate. That was phenomenal, very interesting. And as others have said earlier, today we are meeting at a very challenging time, and Kate's donut concept that captures both the planetary boundaries and the social foundations is very, very timely. From the OECD's perspective, we are marking actually this year a 10th anniversary of Green Growth Strategy, which OECD countries adopted as a response to the 2008 global financial economic crisis as a recovery strategy. So that was back then. Since then, there have been growing tensions between social goals and environmental goals. Inequalities have grown and social cohesion has eroded in many places, many countries. And at the same time, we are facing unprecedented environmental emergency, climate change, biodiversity loss, life shortening, air pollution, plastic pollution, some of which you mentioned earlier, just to name a few. There are many win-win solutions that can put us within the donuts, ideally, and we want to maximize and scale those up. But sometimes there are also trade-offs between the social and green goals. We've seen, for example, in the Gilets jaunes movement or the yellow jacket movement in France, where I live, where we happen to be located, when basically the government tried to introduce a carbon tax, and then it was met by massive social protest, basically for households. That would mean it would be too much of a strain if the energy prices go up. So, how do we make these, how do we square the circle? The protesters, they said the government talks about climate change, the end of the world, but for them, well, we worry about end of the month, right? So again, there's a tension between the long term and short term also. So at the OECD, we have been focusing on environment and inequality nexus, building on the multidimensional lens of what we have, the so-called OECD well-being framework, and then also to get a better understanding of how to maximize the win-win solutions to put us inside the donut, but also how to mitigate the potentially negative impacts of some of the ambitious green policies that we also want governments to adopt. And then came the COVID crisis, which only amplified the urgency to address both the societal challenges and environmental challenges together. And so today we are talking about basically how do we move ahead with the people-centered green transition, again, the social and environment together. And just a few words on COVID response, since Richard mentioned. Last spring, many countries were quick to publicly commit to green recovery, and many national and subnational stimulus packages were introduced to address the socio-economic impact of the crisis, but also to be green at the same time. Now, turning the rhetoric of a green and sustainable recovery into reality was the focus of our OECD ministers meeting that happened last October. And the theme was strong, resilient, green, and inclusive path to recovery. Now, OECD ministers laid out the priorities for the recovery to restart the hard-hit part of the economy, support jobs, promote clean technologies, and sustainable quality infrastructure, while increasing new opportunities for those adversely affected. All these multiple objectives, it's sometimes hard to hit them all at the same time. And specifically, OECD countries have stressed the need to advance towards a circular, resource-efficient economy, in Kate's word, the regenerative economy, and achieving a carbon neutral transition. And the country also emphasized the key role of sustainable finance. And I think I saw from the local action, that was one of the key areas in Kate's slide also, finance, and also infrastructure to achieve sustainable green recovery. Now, in line with these sort of the marching orders that OECD governments gave us, we have been at the OECD Secretariat, we've been focusing on two key areas of our work going forward now and in the next year. First is to renew our long-standing effort to develop and refine measurement tools, methodologies, and approaches that encompass all aspects that matter to sustainability and people's well-being, going beyond the traditional economic indicators such as GDP and labor and employment, to include environmental and social dimensions. And second area of our focus now is to continue to track recovery measures announced by different countries to analyze the environmental dimensions of these recovery measures. Now, we are developing and updating a database and now we have collected quite a bit, and we are going through validation and checking by governments themselves at the moment. We're hoping that we'll be able to release it soon once they're checking and their okay is granted to us. And we're also refining the categories of potential environmental impacts of the recovery measures. Now, based on this database, our preliminary finding, what we see is that we can say seeds of green recovery are there, but we're not there yet. We are tracking both stimulus spending, which are huge in terms of redistributive efforts by government, but also regulatory changes that have been introduced as a response to the COVID crisis. And now we see both those that are good for the environment, bad for the environment. Now, with all the good intentions of green recovery, that's all there, but the reality backed by public spending level and direction show that the green spending is still a very, very small percentage of total stimulus in the key environmentally relevant sectors. So that's why we say we are still not there yet. And this implies that as we stand today, existing stimulus is oriented towards more of a status quo and not sufficiently aligned for a transformational change that we want to see. So now, so going forward, I'm just going to finish now. We're going to try to continue to work to tease out the best practices to make COVID response measures that put us inside the donut, to kickstart the economy and boost jobs and investment, ensure social safety net, and at the same time deliver on the green objectives. So I leave it there, and if there's interest, there's more details I could share about this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kumi. That was really, really interesting, to see that there are some seeds there, there is some promise. Zeenat, let me turn it over to you. What do you see from the Doughnut Economics as being especially relevant for developing countries, where we really have a litany of challenges? For the first time in a generation, we are seeing poverty going up, and the latest number says 130 million people have entered poverty because of COVID and what it's done. So you've got high unemployment, you've got rampant impacts of climate change, massive biodiversity loss, and of course, all the pollution that the pictures that we saw from Kate, usually so much worse in developing countries than developed countries. So what is it from the Doughnut Economics that you think we can draw in developing countries to take a different path or a better path than the one that we've had in the past?
Thanks, Richard, and thank you, Kate, for a lovely presentation. Lots of thoughts that are going on in my mind, but I think I will sort of provide a concise kind of a view of where I see the donut resonating with these, for an answer for the complex issues that you talk about. The pandemic, as you know, it sort of put a mirror to the fact that our total mismanagement of natural ecosystems and the absolute inequity in society, these are connected concerns, and countries like India actually have the possibility of moving on a different path, a path that will address the resilience of our local economies and rebuild our local ecology. I say specifically local ecology because unless we do that, we will also be responding to the global systems that we spoke about. The fundamental issue, like Kate mentioned, is when we look at that typical iceberg diagram, it's at the bottom. It's where we start. What is the intent of the economic models that we are working with at this point of time? An intent being the maximization of profits for a few at the cost of both widespread destruction of local economies and local ecosystems. If we turn this around, the donuts seems to provide answers, and it validates the pathways for countries like ours, where millions are still below the social floor and are going faster down in under, as you mentioned. And I say validate because these are the principles that we need to apply. The donut principles are fundamental Gandhian principles which we inherited. We have unfortunately diluted them considerably in our race for GDP-led growth. So yes, growth is important for us, but for doing what? And prosperity and to thrive, I think the terms that Kate used don't seem to find the lexicon of our policymakers very much. What I see the following, from the donut, which resonates for us and also reflects in many ways in the work that my organization, Development Alternatives, is doing, is as follows. The first is localization and decentralization. That as principle of growing. We have to have strategies, technologies, business models, and market models that generate and retain value at local levels, and also that try and close resource and energy loops as locally as possible. We have the technologies for it, and we saw it in Kate's presentations also. The science and technology seems to favor that now, whether it's agriculture or construction or water management, sewage management. But what we need is these technologies to work and the business models to be designed for the community levels, for the local enterprise levels, for the local government levels. That coupled with the simple lifestyle solutions that we inherited, which we are losing, such as eating what's local, using local resource-based for construction materials, local skills for that. I see this as a spiral. The shorter, the more complete the loop at the origin or nearer the production point, the lower is the carbon and resource footprint, the higher the motivation for managing resultant environmental impacts, and more evident the immediate local economy benefits. We've seen this in our work in housing and construction in India, where small enterprises are providing construction services or converting debris into building materials, or and so we see this circularity and local economy working and bringing incomes. This then brings me to the second aspect, which is the right scaling of the private enterprise. I think what I also see from what Kate has been presenting is that we should be debunking this whole efficiencies of scale concept. It doesn't work anymore if we have to look at the diverse, decentralized, and distributed densities of our populations. We don't live in, we do have some mammoth cities, but generally we live in a distributed, decentralized manner, and so should our solutions be, both production as well as service delivery solutions. And so the design of the private sector, if that is where the whole capital and whole initiative and whole energy is, because the public sector seems to have given up its responsibility for many of these things, is not the large industrial mammoth large sized investments, but in the small scale investments. And that is where we need to figure out how small a scale is viable and desirable, and that which can respond contextually. So again, housing comes to my mind, local microgrids come to my mind, is what we are doing. We have found solutions for water and sanitation management in our recent work, as we are searching for decentralized solutions for small cities, and we find that there's immense potential and possibilities. And we find that local models ensure, for example, for water supply in our villages, in our work, they're ensuring water conservation of water at the local microshed level. They're improving local bodies. They're enabling local delivery and supply of safe water. And they're managing the quality, the pricing, the quantity benchmarks within their local communities, transparently sharing the benefits and making sure that the value is also retained. We need a lot of infrastructure as this country is growing, as the villages get transformed into small towns into larger cities. But who will produce this infrastructure? How will it be produced? Who will earn from the process of production and process of supply? I think that is critical in the way we need to go forward. The third aspect that I see is the necessary shift that we must make from just singular financial capital maximization to include human and institutional capital growth along with natural capital regeneration. So, just as we are trying to measure CO2, we're trying to measure enhancement of biodiversity, we must also measure our own institutional and human capabilities that are growing in the process in all of our economic activities and sectors. And we don't really have the data systems at the moment to do that, or the measurement systems to do that, to include this in our economic activities. The final and the fourth area of the donut that the donut is helping me unravel, or also is very relevant for our work, is what Kate is calling the distributional equity in the green economy models. Greening within the current capitalist and free market economic system is an oxymoron. What it's going to do is three things. And we already see it happening: concentration of economic and resource value in a few hands, resource ownership, natural resource ownership in a few hands, increased vulnerabilities of communities who lose access to these resources. They face the shifted burdens of environmental pollution, and ecosystems in distant places. We've seen that very recently in the Himalayan disasters that collapse. So you have a city like Delhi and other cities around it that have huge demands on the water systems hundreds of kilometers away in the Gangetic glaciers. And when that sort of collapses, we see what is happening. So I just end by saying that, what we need for India, as we look at the donut, is integrating not just environmental costs and benefits, but also social costs and benefits into our both production systems and demand, and designing the local value creation and local value retention through the green SMEs, and designed wealth redistribution through business models that consider all stakeholders in the value chain as shareholders with fair equity arrangements. We don't see that happening very at the moment. So thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much, Zeenat. That was really interesting, and which reinforces many of the points. Kate, very quickly, because we'd like to open the floor for some of the questions in the chat box, many of which are recurring. Anything in particular you'd like to respond to? Maybe, it's 2 or 3 minutes.
Yes, and I will be quick, because I've loved both of these contributions, and I know that I just want to turn this into a conversation with the questions people are asking. On Kumi's points, of course, tensions are arising as we try to transform to create industrial systems that actually work with the cycles of the living planet for the first time. Of course, it creates social tensions because, of course, we've neglected in the past. So the Gilets jaunes, I think, is a good example actually of people who live outside cities suddenly finding that their transport is becoming incredibly expensive. And I wonder whether if the same thing would have happened if it were in a place like Curitiba that had already put in place actually affordable mass transit, had created distributed transport networks instead of leaving everyone relying on the private car. What I understand from many Gilets jaunes protesters, they said, we're not protesting against taking action on climate change. It's that the taxes are coming again and again and again on those already at the bottom of the social structures. So it's the inequality, and to me it's the inequality that comes through every time. Why are we finding a tension between taking action on climate change and protecting people's fundamental rights? Because there are deep inequalities that mean that those who are already worst off are getting squeezed. We know that over the past decade, the number of billionaires worldwide has doubled. It's doubled from 1,000 billionaires to 2,000 billionaires. And that's a macro stat, but I'm sure within nations, we've seen many people have become much, much better off, and those who are worse off have taken the hit time and again. So it's about the inequalities, and it's the responsibility of governments to stop allowing wealth to accumulate, to not tax those who are accumulating that wealth, to not restructure regulation in all the way that Zeenat's describing, regulation to ensure that business doesn't just keep pulling off financial capital, but that actually reinvests in the regeneration of all forms of human well-being. And then just secondly on that, many OECD countries, it's fantastic if OECD countries are saying we're going to act on climate change and become carbon neutral. I think we all know that there's almost no governments in the world who have set a soon enough target for that. 2050 is way too far away. It's got nothing like the scale of ambition that actually science and reality is telling us now is needed. And we want to see countries putting in place a circular economy. The Netherlands is one of the few that I know of that said, by 2050, we'll be circular. Oh, by 2030, within a decade, we will be 50% of the way there. What if every OECD country had the guts, the conviction, the ambition, and the actual action to say, right, all of us, by 2030, we will commit to having 50% circular use of materials? That would be transformative of industries. It would actually create energy. It would open up new designs. Students would say, you mean I get to use my engineering design skills? I get to use my circular design skills. I don't have to put them away in a drawer and go and work for old companies. I get to use the education I've just acquired. Amazing. I see released in the Netherlands and in Amsterdam an energy, an excitement about designing the future that I do not see in other places. So we need the regulation to unleash our creativity. And then on Zeenat's contribution, well, I have to say, I just love hearing her talk about, I'm hearing the donut in action in that distributed, decentralized, localized, empowering local communities, creating solutions that are local. And yes, we're moving away from the idea that good business is efficient and centralized, and that is what centralizes returns of value. It's distributive, it's resilient, and it's smaller scale, and it's localized. And I think we will, and we have the technologies that are now allow us to return to that. I want to say one thing, which is so the portrait method that I presented was developed for cities of the global north, that four lens. One of the things we're doing at Doughnut Economics Action Lab over the coming months is saying, and working with a group of partners from the global south, saying, what would it make this useful to you in your context, in your cities? And I'm delighted that Development Alternatives are one of our organizations that we're partnering with on that. If anybody on this webinar is interested, please join Doughnut Economics Action Lab. It's doughuteconomics.org. We will, at the point where we're ready, share that methodology with anybody who wants to contribute, because we're creating methodologies openly. So if anybody wants to have a look and have a comment on it, please join our organization, sign up for our newsletter. You will get informed, and you would be able to contribute to saying, how do we make that city donut portrait relevant to the needs and the context of the global south?
Great, thanks very much, Kate. So Kate, first a question to you, and then very, very quickly, and I will interrupt if we go on, because we need to take the questions from the floor. So Kate, there was a number of questions which keep coming up to, so what's the first step? What's the entry point? How do we begin to apply the donut? And, related to that, and the second question quickly, Kumi and Zeenat, what do you see as the main barriers to change, right? I mean, all of this, it's fine to talk the talk, but how do you go from talking the talk to shifting minds and shifting structures to actually walk the walk? So what do you see as the main barriers to, of course, a high-minded intent? But Kate, what's the first step? You're going to a country which is not like Amsterdam, or a city that's not like Amsterdam. How do we pry open the conversation?
Okay, so first of all, at Doughnut Economics and Action Lab, we've never tried to pry open a conversation. We've never tried to tell anybody you should use the donut or talk about the donut or embrace the donut, because there are so many change makers at every level who are already wanting to do this. We work with people who say we already want to do this. So to me, the first step is here. It's the mindset. It's letting go of the 20th century economics that so many of us were taught. Let's just leave it behind because it was not designed for our time. So it's a mindset shift. And the second step is here. It's conviction. And we need governments and mayors and city councillors and business leaders who just say, you know what? I just know it's time to do this. I just know it's time to put this regulation in place. And so I'm going to vote for it. And so I'm going to act on it. And so I'm going to change my company. It's conviction. It's human conviction. That's what's needed. End.
Kumi, any observations? And then we're going to
Yeah,
Zeenat.
sure. Your question was about the barriers, but you can also flip it around to say, what are the areas where, as Kate said, it's conviction, but how can we get rid of any barriers that may be? And I think that's what Kate said has a lot to do with local action. And very often, there's been a sense, OECD has been working on a lot of like inclusiveness, inclusive growth model and all this. And there's also a lot of work on trust in government. And as we've seen in the last few years, there's been this erosion of trust in government or trust in experts. What are we to do? Experts, economists, if people don't trust in analytical, evidence-based recommendation, what do we do? And I think there's this, because of this inequality, there's been this, what's the word, right word I'm looking for, the dispersion of people who are studying things of relevance that we're talking about today, day in and day out, and people who are just going about living their everyday lives. This gap, so if people feel that that's something for experts, they don't feel that it's something that affects their everyday life. So this something that's tangible, and that's really about public participation in government or policy making. And at least in many OECD countries, this is something that governments have been talking about, and we have been actually studying, not so much in the environment area, but it's also relevant for environment or green policy making, how to involve the public. And I've seen in some countries, there's a lot of sort of town hall meetings to talk about policy making. And this is where Kate's focus on bringing it down to local government level is very interesting, because by nature, that's where people and the government decisions at the local level is much closer than federal or national level. Another thing is, and Kate touched on this earlier too, is education and skills. There's a lot of human ingenuity, a lot of progress in innovation, technology, everything that you talked about already. And it's really the next generation. So I think there's been a survey taken, maybe many of you are aware of this the PISA survey that OECD does on the literacy, math and scientific literacy of 15-year-olds across the world to see. And what is the level of understanding of environmental challenges for young people, for 15-year-olds? And actually the young people do understand, and they understand what why climate change happens and all this. But a lot of people still feel powerless about, okay, so how do I transform that for me to make a change myself, career choices, higher education choices. So I think that's another area where the skills and education that prepares the young people for the green jobs and green technology that are needed in mass scale tomorrow. So I think these are the areas where we have to tackle the public participation and decision making, and skills and education, especially in STEM, science, engineering, technology, and math. Thanks.
Zeenat, a few quick remarks.
Yeah.
So we can get
very, very quick remarks. I think building on to what Kumi said, from public participation space, I think one barrier that we have, at least in the global south here, is platforms where, and if we take cities as example, cities and citizens and small entrepreneurs can come together. We actually don't have platforms that can bring multi-stakeholders. together and help aggregate the large problems with the small scale solutions. So that aggregation possibility, and in a way, the smaller cities also lack the capacity and the agency to do that in their governance levels. So that's one, governance capacities and agency at even the municipality level that needs to grow. The second space that I think we should be looking at really is while we do this is breaking, the cliched siloed nature of functioning, which it prevents us from looking at the multiple potential benefits that can arise when we look at something holistically. So, when the city designs programs, actually the city in most cities in India are actually implementing centralized programs. So when those programs are implemented, they have very designed and implemented, they're very single point agendas and single point objectives, not looking at how, holistic thinking will enable them the multiple benefits for maximum stakeholders, and they really lose out on that. And so I think that's one space we need to address. And finally, of course, we don't have the data systems and indicators to help the cities, help the design of the business models to make choices that will integrate nature and human capacities adequately into programs and schemes. So we don't have those data systems and measurement methods. They exist globally, I know they've been used, but they've not been I'd say mainstreamed into our public programs. They've not been mainstreamed into our business choices, and that is a space that really requires action from our end. The world of finance has really not figured out how to invest in the large numbers of small scale that are the defining characteristic of countries like India. And the large centralized programs that are designed with macro data, they don't look at, they look at large scale standardized solutions, not principles that may be applied locally and contextually. So I think those barriers, and we can look at them as barriers, or we can turn them around and say, okay, this is where the opportunities lie, and we can act on those.
Thank you so much, Zeenat. We're going to now open for questions from the floor. There's one that's come up in many ways, and Kumi mentioned it, Zeenat mentioned it, Kate, you mentioned it, and that's the role of education. To some extent, it's a matter of trust, and there were a variant of that saying, so how is the Doughnut different from, say, ecological economics, where we have been worrying about these things, or people have been in ecological economics. So before we open up more generally, given the number of questions about the role of the education system in education, Kate, anything you'd like to tell us about that? And then maybe GGKP, we can start reading out some of the questions.
Sure, just very briefly. So I studied economics at university in the early 1990s, and I ended up walking away from it because I was very frustrated that the issues I cared about were somehow marginal to what I was taught. I came back to it 15 years later, after experience in the world, and when people were saying, hey, we need to rewrite economics because of the financial crisis, we need to reflect financial reality. And I thought, what? So after all this, we're only going to reflect financial reality in economic theory. What about ecological reality? What about social reality and inequalities? And I read all of the economics I had not been taught. I read ecological economics and feminist economics and complexity and behavioral and institutional economics. And there were amazing insights in all of these. But rather than leave them as silos, oh, I'm an ecological economist and I'm a feminist economist, why would we do that? Why don't we bring them all together? And I wanted to see in Doughnut Economics what happens when they dance on the same page. So if somebody looking at the Doughnut says, I see ecological economics, yes, it's based on the work of Herman Daly. And the embedded economy diagram I showed, in fact, aims to combine ecological economics, the economy is embedded in the living world, feminist economics, there's the market, the state, and the household, and commons theory, so Elinor Ostrom's insights. I'm trying to bring them into one diagram so that we, as Zeenat is saying, why be siloed when you can be holistic? Why not start with the whole? So Doughnut Economics is not some brand new invention. It is my attempt to bring together incredible work that's been around either for decades or for centuries in different cultural traditions. And I love a quote from André Gide. He says, everything that needs to be said has already been said. But since nobody was listening, it has to be said again. So this time I'm saying it with a donut. And we need to keep saying it again and again and drawing it again and measuring it again until we get it.
Thank you so much. Would our colleagues from GGKP like to ask any of the questions, or would you like? Sorry, can you hear me?
Now we can hear you.
Yeah. Oh, great. So there's a question on costs. Will this not cost more? And where will the money come from? Kate.
Will this not cost more? What we're doing is costing the earth. So, I mean, what do we want to value, right? Cost is a word that tells us about value. What we value is human thriving, and that is the source of wealth creation. If people have health and education and security and community, that is where humanity can create wealth from. And it depends upon a living planet on which we can thrive. That is the fundamental source of value. We need to design finance to be in service to life. And therefore, I think we need to completely redesign finance, because at the moment we have a financial system that's in service to itself. So cost to me is about value that's worth investing in regenerating living systems. And it may sound like I'm talking in a very abstract way, but I think we need to start with what we fundamentally value and then bring in money, which has a design, right? Who gets to issue money? Who has the power to create money? What can that money be used for? And what character does that money have? These design traits of how we design money totally determines the impact it has in the world. Money is a social construct, as is finance. So we can design it and redesign it, but we can't redesign the living world, and we know what humanity needs. So let's start with the fundamental values. So will it cost more? It will. You know, OECD countries and European countries at the moment are still investing millions, billions, it's 5 trillion worldwide in fossil fuel subsidies. So why are we doing that? We're spending money on destroying the living planet. Let's move that money. And by the way, countries that have a sovereign currency, countries that are in charge of their own currency creation, I'm talking about the UK, I'm talking about the US and Canada and Japan, these countries can create money. That's what they've always done. Governments create money that can be spent into purpose. So if you have people available to do work that's worth doing, we can afford it. What we need to make sure is that the entire financial system is in service of the values that we already know we want to create and regenerate.
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, just as an observation, one of the odd anomalies we have is this, the fact that financial markets can boom, whereas the real economy is actually in recession. And that is quite dangerous to have that sort of system where we have this sort of excessive savings in some quarters of the economy and very, very low returns. And that, you know, that's not without its risks, having that kind of a situation. On that theme, just to take it the next stage further, there is a question over here which says, so what is the best pathway to actually get change? Is it bottom up from the city up, as many of you have been saying, or is it much more top down? Do we have to change upstream policy? So what's the way to actually get this going? Do we work from the city up, communities? There's been so much emphasis here. Or do we really need to get the national governments to change their macro policies and thinking?
I'm happy to jump in a really fast answer. It would be so helpful. It would have been so helpful if 25 years ago, the world's governments had acted on climate change on the scale and speed that we need to happen. It would be wonderful if it happened top down and just created the regulatory framework that everything follows. It hasn't happened. It would be wonderful if individual nations or collections of nations like the European Union would put in place action on climate change, action on circular economy on the scale that we know is required, but it hasn't happened. And so it's come down to the next level. So yes, it's wonderful when cities step up and lead. And sometimes cities don't do that either. And that's why it goes to neighborhoods and community groups. So leadership is emerging where people are actually having the conviction to start leading. There's only so much a city can do because it's happening, it's acting with Amsterdam, right? I'm holding up Amsterdam, but there's only so much Amsterdam can do. It's happening within Dutch government regulation, which is happening within the European context, which is happening in the global context. But leadership bubbles up because there are people everywhere who know it's time to act and don't wait for everybody else. So action begins where people are ready to act. Our work at Doughnut Economics Action Lab is just to work with the change makers who are already in action. We're finding that many of them are at the city level. Something about cities brings people together on a scale where they can actually meet in a room. In some countries, people are more proud to say the city they're from than the nation they're from. That's certainly true, I think, in my country. So there's something about cities that makes people feel positive and for and enacting, and we can see that change around us. So let's work with that. It doesn't mean it's the ideal place or the right place to start, but it's happening. So let's go with that energy.
If I may come in, I think both are needed because, of course, local action, you know, that's closest place to citizens and individuals. It's very important. But of course, as Kate said, it's very important to have top-down national level policy because that sets the tone. And in fact, there's a lot of good practices and many countries and jurisdictions have put in place. Now, again, I said earlier, it's one thing to have intentions and policy statement or policies in place. Implementation is that's where the challenge lies. So lots of goals and targets have been set, some quite ambitious. You know, we see it in Europe, some, for example, Korea has done this big Green Deal package as a response to the crisis. In many different countries, we do see good practices. And what we do is to help countries, national governments exchange, oh, did it work this way? Oh, but this was a little bit different. You know, this kind of we provide at the OECD a forum for exchange of country experiences in implementing. So there's, you have to put the right policy in place, and fossil fuel subsidy, you're spot on. I mean, that's what we've been saying all along. It doesn't make sense to be giving all the money, public funds, you know, public money, taxpayer money to fossil fuel exploration and both production and consumption, and with the other hand, trying to boost clean energy. And the scale is actually not on par. I mean, so much going for supporting the status quo at the moment. So yes, the top level government policy is important, but again, there's a lot that can be gained from learning from each other. I'm talking about at the national government level of what works and what doesn't, and how can we tweak and define, refine and improve implementation.
And if I may come in here, you know, I agree with Kumi, it has to happen both ways, but we do see the pushback, if I may say, from the social movements, from the communities, from cities, against what they're saying. It's too slow a movement by the national governments, and sometimes movement in the reverse direction. We see local microgrids challenging massive solar parks, for example, and I think the role for ground level practice to inform policy, we haven't taken that very seriously. So yes, policy to policy exchanges between nations, yes, but practice to policy learning is critical. And we from the policy space, yeah, you need macro data, but I think what we need is not very well designed boxed solutions. We need flexibility and openness that enable the local systems to start doing things for themselves within a guideline and framework.
So we're almost at the end. There is a question, Kate, over to you, and then I'm going to try to sum up in about 30 seconds. Kate, so we know that in much of the developing world, we have an informal economy, and in fact, the informal is the normal in terms of employment in much of the developing world. So, you know, how do we use the insights of Doughnut Economics to make life better for this vast network of the informal economies? If you have any thoughts on that.
My main thought on that is to say that I'm so looking forward to working with people like Zeenat at Development Alternatives and in the Global South, who say this is our reality. How can this framework be useful to us? I'm sitting here in the Global North, and so it's not for me to say how this framework is most useful. I'm so looking forward to working with people who say it's useful. Let's match it with our reality and find the insights and see where it works, and where it doesn't work, let's not use it. There's no need to push it. There's other frameworks to use. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
That's fantastic, Kate. So we are at the end. So let me end with just a few words. I think what we have seen. Firstly, thank you so much, Kate. I think everyone has learnt a lot. So many of the comments suggest, and I'm pretty sure it's okay, is can we use your talk in our classrooms and in the organizations in which we work, and I'm sure that's okay. So that's just a mark out of all the people that we've had, is how much of an impact this has had. So thank you very much. And I think what we've heard is that there is an opportunity. It's not too late. There are seeds of promise, as Kumi has said, in terms of building back better and doing better. It's not just platitudes, but I think it's fair to say the jury is still out. You know, when we talk about trade, Will we see a carbon border adjustment in the EU? Will it be a good thing? Will it be a bad thing? Will we pivot back to a world of free trade or fair trade or anti-trade? Will we pivot back to a world that says dismantle the state or strengthen the role of the state? We've seen where the state has been strong. The deployment of the vaccines has been much, much stronger and much, much more efficient. Will we see cooperation, quite importantly, at a local scale as much as at a global scale for the global public goods? And I think this is exactly the sort of conversation that we want and the frameworks that we want to challenge our thinking and to show us the realm of the possibilities. We need very many more Amsterdams and the Netherlands actually to be scaled up in very many different contexts. And I think, you know, the way you're going about this, Kate, is exactly the right way, is to have this network of knowledge and to grow and to think about how we actually get there. So let me thank you profoundly on behalf of all of the listeners, Kate, Juergen, to you for your opening remarks, Kumi for your insights, and Zeenat also for your insights. This was a wonderful panel, and thanks very much to GGKP for hosting this. Everyone, have a wonderful day, evening, and afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.